It all started innocently enough. My wife, Sophie, and I had been married for 8 years. Our bond felt unshakable, or so I thought. This past summer, we decided to take a long overdue vacation to the coast. It was idyllic. Clear skies, the sound of waves crashing, and sunsets that seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon. We laughed together, took pictures, and even found ourselves talking late into the night like we hadn't in years. On the third day, while we were strolling along the beach, Sophie spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was a man named Mark. She introduced him as a college classmate she hadn't seen in years. He was charming, confident, and a little too smooth for my liking. "Mark, I can't believe it's you," Sophie exclaimed, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a while. They caught up quickly. He told us he was in town on business, staying at a nearby hotel. His smile lingered a little too long on Sophie as he spoke. I remember the small pang of jealousy I felt then, but I shook it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. That night, we had dinner with Mark at Sophie's suggestion. Over the meal, I learned he wasn't just a classmate, but someone she'd once dated briefly before we met. Sophie waved it off like it was ancient history, and I tried to convince myself it was harmless. But something about Mark's demeanor unsettled me. The way he leaned in too close when talking to Sophie. The way her laughter at his jokes seemed a bit too carefree. It was probably nothing, I told myself. We were on vacation. Wasn't this the time to let go of paranoia? The following day, Sophie mentioned running into Mark again at a coffee shop while I was out for a swim. "What a coincidence," she said, brushing it off as casual. But her excitement as she relayed their conversation set off alarms I didn't want to acknowledge. By the time our vacation ended, Mark had slipped back into Sophie's life. We exchanged pleasantries and contact details, though I secretly hoped that would be the end of it. Little did I know, that chance encounter on the beach would unravel everything I thought I knew about my wife, my marriage, and myself. When we got home from the vacation, things seemed normal, at first. Sophie was affectionate, talking about how much she enjoyed the trip and suggesting we plan another one soon. But gradually, I noticed changes. She spent more time on her phone, her notifications lighting up late at night. I asked her once, casually, who she was talking to, and she smiled and said, "Just Monica. You know how chatty she gets." That answer didn't sit right. Sophie and Monica had been friends for years, but Monica was never one to text at all hours. I started watching closely, not because I suspected anything at first, but because something felt off. Sophie began disappearing for hours on weekends, claiming she was shopping or grabbing coffee. When she got back, her mood was almost too cheerful, like she was overcompensating. It wasn't long before Mark's name resurfaced in conversation. "He's so funny," she mentioned one evening, scrolling through her phone. "He's doing so well now, runs his own business, travels all over the place." Her tone was casual, but the sparkle in her I was anything but. I started piecing things together. The late-night texts, the long absences, the sudden glow about her whenever Mark's name came up. One afternoon, while Sophie was in the shower, I glanced at her phone lying on the kitchen counter. I felt guilty, but curiosity got the better of me. Her screen was locked, but the preview of a text message was enough to make my stomach drop. "Mark, yesterday was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." The words felt like a punch to the gut. My hands shook as I put her phone down, pretending I hadn't seen anything. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it emotional, physical, or both? The Sophie I knew wouldn't do this, would she? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay next to her, listening to the even rhythm of her breathing, and tried to convince myself that there had to be an explanation. Maybe it wasn't what it seemed. But deep down, I knew. The next day, I stayed home from work, telling Sophie I wasn't feeling well. While she was out, I began combing through our shared laptop, searching for any clue that might confirm or deny my growing suspicions. In her email, I found hotel reservations, dates that coincided with the time she had claimed to be visiting her sister, receipts for fancy dinners, none of which she had ever mentioned. And then there were photos. They weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. Sophie and Mark at the same beach from our vacation, sitting far too close for comfort. Another of them laughing over drinks, her hand on his arm. It was all I needed to know. I sat there for hours, staring at the evidence, my chest tightening with a mix of anger, betrayal, and a profound sense of loss. I thought of confronting her then and there, but something held me back. A small, stubborn voice in the back of my mind said, "Wait, let her show you who she really is." That night, Sophie came home with her usual cheery demeanor. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and told me she'd picked up takeout for dinner. As I watched her move around the kitchen, chatting about mundane things, I felt a strange sense of calm. If this was going to unravel, I wasn't going to sit idly by. I made a plan. The days after my discovery were surreal. Sophie continued her routine, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. I started paying closer attention to everything she did, every excuse she made. But I didn't confront her, not yet. Confrontation would give her the power to control the narrative, and I wasn't ready for that. I wanted the truth, the whole truth, and I wanted it on my terms. I reached out to a friend, Max, who worked in IT. He had a knack for finding information where others couldn't. I didn't give him all the details, just enough to let him know I suspected Sophie was hiding something. He offered to help without hesitation. The first thing Max suggested was accessing Sophie's cloud account. If she's taking photos or texting on her phone, there's a good chance some of it is synced, he explained. It felt invasive, but I justified it by reminding myself that Sophie had already broken our vows. If she had nothing to hide, I'd find nothing. It didn't take long. Within a day, Max had retrieved dozens of messages between Sophie and Mark. The tone was unmistakable, flirty, intimate, and laced with references to encounters I'd rather not imagine. My stomach churned as I scrolled through their exchanges. In one message, Mark wrote, "Can't believe we almost got caught last time. He's so clueless, isn't he?" The words cut deep, but they also steeled my resolve. If they thought I was clueless, I would show them how wrong they were. Over the next week, I built a dossier of sorts. Every text, every photo, every receipt that pointed to their affair. I found emails where Mark and Sophie planned weekend getaways, all carefully timed to coincide with the visits to her sister or late-night work events. I also started keeping my own notes. When Sophie left the house, I wrote down the time, the excuse she gave, and how long she was gone. I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew I needed to be meticulous. Every detail mattered. One Friday evening, Sophie announced she'd be meeting some old friends for drinks. Her outfit, a fitted dress and heels she usually saved for special occasions, raised an eyebrow, but I nodded and wished her a good time. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I parked a block away from the bar she mentioned and waited. Sure enough, Sophie didn't go inside. Instead, she walked down the street and slipped into a sleek black car. Mark's car. My chest tightened as I watched them drive off together, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was the confirmation I needed. Instead of tailing them, I called Max. "Can you track her phone in real time?" I asked. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. Within minutes, he sent me her location, an address for a boutique hotel downtown. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I debated what to do next. Every instinct screamed at me to drive there, confront them, and demand answers. But I knew better. Confronting them in the heat of the moment would give them a way to twist the story, to downplay the betrayal. I wanted my response to be calculated, undeniable, and final. When Sophie returned home that night, she acted as if nothing had happened. She climbed into bed, kissed me goodnight, and fell asleep almost immediately. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. It was no longer a question of if I would act, but when. And I knew exactly where to start. The next morning, Sophie seemed carefree, humming as she made coffee in the kitchen. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and I caught a glimpse of Mark's name before she quickly grabbed it, smiling down at the screen. I clenched my jaw but said nothing. Let her think I was clueless. It played to my advantage. I spent that weekend preparing for the next step. If Sophie and Mark were so bold as to take their affair to a public hotel, I wondered what other risks they were willing to take. I reached out to a private investigator named Greg, a friend of Max's who specialized in cases like this. We met at a cafe that Sunday afternoon, and I laid everything out for him. The messages, the photos, the receipts, and the location history Max had pulled. Greg listened intently, nodding as I spoke. "They're sloppy," he said finally. "That's good for you. People like this think they're untouchable, but their arrogance is their weakness." We came up with a plan. Greg would tail Sophie on her next outing, gathering hard evidence. Meanwhile, I would continue documenting everything at home. Her excuses, her patterns, her behavior. The goal was to have an airtight case. By midweek, Sophie gave me the perfect opportunity. She announced she'd be attending a networking dinner on Thursday night. I pretended to be supportive, even offering to iron her dress. She laughed, kissed me on the cheek, and thanked me for being the best husband. The irony stung, but I kept my composure. When Thursday arrived, Greg was ready. As Sophie left the house, I sent him her location and waited. Hours passed, each minute stretching endlessly as I paced the living room. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Greg. "Got them," he said. "They're at the same hotel as last time. I have photos of them entering the lobby, going to the bar, and then heading upstairs together." My chest tightened. Even though I had suspected this all along, hearing it confirmed felt like being punched in the gut. "Keep documenting," I told him. "I want everything." The next morning, Greg sent me the evidence, photos, timestamps, and even audio recordings of Sophie and Mark chatting at the bar. They weren't careful, openly discussing their plans for the night and laughing about how oblivious I supposedly was. Mark's words echoed in my ears. "By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late. She's practically mine already." That was when the anger set in. Not the hot, impulsive kind, but a cold, calculated fury. They thought they had me fooled, but in reality, they were playing right into my hands. I wasn't just gathering evidence for closure. I was preparing for war. I started making calls, first to an attorney, then to a financial advisor. Sophie had no idea, but by the end of this, she wouldn't just lose my trust. She'd lose everything she thought she could take from me. The day after Greg sent me the damning evidence, I sat at the breakfast table with Sophie, my mind a whirlwind of plans and emotions. She was radiant, her smile brighter than it had been in years. The thought of her glow being fueled by Mark's attention instead of our life together filled me with a bitter mixture of rage and sadness. "Anything interesting happening today?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. "Just the usual," she replied, sipping her coffee. "Some errands, maybe lunch with Monica. What about you?" I shrugged. "Work's keeping me busy. Probably just the same old grind." Her smile faltered for a moment, as though she could sense something unspoken in my words, but then she quickly recovered. "You're such a hard worker," she said, reaching out to touch my hand. The hypocrisy of her affection made me want to laugh, but I played along, nodding in agreement. Once she left the house, I set my plan into motion. Over the last week, I had been discreetly meeting with an attorney, a sharp woman named Evelyn who specialized in high-stakes divorces. I presented her with all the evidence Greg and I had collected, and her reaction was immediate. "This is more than enough," she said, flipping through the photos and transcripts. "You're in a strong position. If she tries to contest anything, she'll lose." Evelyn and I crafted a strategy that would ensure Sophie came away from this divorce with as little as possible. We froze the joint bank accounts, began preparing the necessary paperwork, and drafted an agreement that would favor me in the division of assets. Sophie would have no clue until it was too late. In the meantime, I took steps to safeguard my mental and emotional well-being. I started hitting the gym again, channeling my anger into physical strength. Each lift, each sprint, felt like a small victory over the helplessness I'd been drowning in for weeks. I also began reconnecting with friends I had drifted from during the marriage. A few beers with old buddies reminded me that there was a world outside of the suffocating tension of my home life. I realized how much I had isolated myself, prioritizing Sophie's happiness over my own. That was going to change. The hardest part of my plan was maintaining the facade at home. Sophie continued her charade, cooking dinner, asking about my day, and even suggesting we plan a weekend getaway. The audacity of it was almost comical, but I stayed calm. Every time I wanted to lash out, to confront her with the evidence, I reminded myself of the bigger picture. Acting impulsively would give her control, a chance to manipulate the situation or twist the narrative. I wasn't going to let that happen. I also kept Greg on standby, continuing to monitor her movements. I wanted to be absolutely certain there was no escape for her when the moment of reckoning came. Sophie thought she had all the power, but she was walking into a trap, one I had built with careful, deliberate precision. The days following my decision to act were surreal. It was like living a double life. By day, I maintained the role of the dutiful husband, calm, attentive, and supportive. By night, I became the architect of Sophie's downfall, working with Evelyn, Greg, and Max to ensure every detail of my plan was airtight. The quiet power I felt, knowing I was finally taking control, was unlike anything I'd experienced. Sophie, meanwhile, continued her game, none the wiser. She even started being unusually sweet, perhaps out of guilt, or maybe she just enjoyed the thrill of deceiving me. She would kiss me goodnight, tell me how grateful she was for my support, and then sneak off to her phone to text Mark while she thought I was asleep. I didn't confront her. I didn't need to. The clock was ticking. One evening, as Sophie chatted away about her plans for the upcoming week, I feigned interest while silently noting every detail. She mentioned an upcoming conference for work, which I knew was another rendezvous with Mark. My chest tightened, but I nodded, pretending to believe her. "Sounds like a good opportunity," I said, forcing a smile. "You think so?" she asked, her eyes searching mine for some sign of suspicion. "Of course," I lied, sipping my coffee. "I trust you completely." She looked relieved, and for a brief moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. The next day, I met Greg at his office to review the latest findings. He had gone above and beyond, capturing not just photos of Sophie and Mark, but also audio recordings from the hotel bar where they frequently met. As I listened to them laugh about how easy it was to deceive me, my resolve hardened. "I've got something new," Greg said, handing me a folder. "They're planning to leave town. Mark mentioned moving to another state to start fresh. Sophie seems hesitant, but it's clear they've been talking about it seriously." I opened the folder to find printed copies of their text exchanges, discussing where they might live, how they'd manage financially, and, most damningly, how they'd handle me. "Mark, he'll never see it coming. We'll just disappear, and by the time he figures it out, we'll be gone." "Sophie, I don't know. It feels so final. Are you sure it's the right move?" "Mark, trust me. This is our chance to finally be free." Reading those words felt like a knife twisting in my gut, but it also gave me clarity. They weren't just cheating. They were planning an escape, leaving me to pick up the pieces of the life we'd built. "I want this done before they get the chance," I told Greg. "It will be," he assured me. "We're one step ahead." That night, I moved to the final stages of preparation. I transferred funds into a private account, secured sensitive documents, and began arranging for the locks on the house to be changed. Sophie thought she was running the game, but she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The time had come to make my first move. I'd spent weeks gathering evidence, securing my assets, and quietly orchestrating a future where Sophie and Mark would pay for their betrayal. My patience was wearing thin, but I knew that rushing this would jeopardize everything. If Sophie wanted to play games, I would ensure the rules were mine. That Friday evening, Sophie left for her conference. I watched her pack her bag with unnecessary precision, folding her clothes meticulously. She kissed me on the cheek, gave me her usual parting smile, and told me not to wait up. "Have a great weekend," I said, hiding the anger boiling beneath the surface. The moment she pulled out of the driveway, I got to work. I called Greg to confirm her location. Sure enough, she wasn't heading to any conference. She was on her way to meet Mark at the same boutique hotel they'd used before. By now, I knew their patterns. They'd have dinner in the hotel restaurant, linger at the bar, and then retreat to a room upstairs. Greg had already arranged for surveillance, photos, audio, and even video recordings. He would have everything I needed by the morning. While Greg handled the evidence, I began executing my end of the plan. First, I contacted Evelyn, my attorney, who confirmed that the paperwork for our divorce was ready to be filed. Everything was airtight. The financial records, the proof of adultery, and the documentation of Sophie's ongoing deception. "This will devastate her case," Evelyn said. "She won't have a leg to stand on." I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Good. Let's set the wheels in motion. Next, I called a locksmith to schedule a visit for early the following week. By the time Sophie returned home, she wouldn't be able to walk through the front door without a key I wouldn't provide. Her belongings would be packed and ready for her to pick up, supervised, of course. I spent the rest of the evening securing anything she might try to take. Documents, valuables, even small sentimental items that mattered more to me than I realized. I boxed up everything of hers, leaving nothing out of place. I wanted her departure to feel clinical, not emotional. By the time midnight rolled around, Greg had sent me the first batch of evidence. Photos of Sophie and Mark entering the hotel, laughing and holding hands like giddy teenagers. A video of them sitting close at the bar, talking openly about their plans. I could barely stomach it, but I forced myself to watch. She's all in on this, Greg told me when I called. They think they've won. Let them think that, I replied. The fall will be harder. As I sat alone in the quiet house, I realized the gravity of what I was doing. This wasn't just about exposing Sophie's betrayal. It was about reclaiming my life. By morning, her double life would start unraveling, and there would be no way for her to piece it back together. Saturday morning dawned with an unusual stillness. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but it gave me clarity. As Sophie and Mark indulged in their fantasy at the hotel, I began dismantling the life she thought she had so carefully built. Greg sent me more updates throughout the morning. His final batch of evidence included audio of Sophie talking about her dissatisfaction with our marriage, peppered with dismissive remarks about me. "He's too predictable," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I feel like I've been living with a stranger for years. Mark understands me in ways he never could." Hearing those words stung, but they also cemented my resolve. This wasn't about love lost anymore. It was about betrayal, disrespect, and reclaiming the self-worth she had so casually discarded. By noon, Evelyn had filed the divorce papers, complete with a wealth of evidence detailing Sophie's infidelity. Her financial misconduct, charges she had hidden on our joint accounts for expensive gifts and hotel stays, only strengthened my case. The next step was informing the people in her life who needed to know the truth. I wasn't out for public humiliation, but I refused to let her twist the narrative. I sent a carefully worded email to her parents, explaining that I'd discovered her ongoing affair and was filing for divorce. I attached the less explicit pieces of evidence, enough to show them that this wasn't speculation but fact. It wasn't long before my phone rang. It was Sophie's mother. "What is this about?" she demanded, her voice a mix of shock and anger. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I said calmly, "but Sophie's been cheating on me. I filed for divorce." Her mother was silent for a long moment. "This doesn't sound like her." "I didn't think it did either," I replied. "But the proof is undeniable. I've sent you everything you need to understand." By the end of the call, her mother was subdued, promising to speak with Sophie once she returned. The real blow came that afternoon. Mark's wife, or rather, his soon-to-be ex-wife, called me. Greg had tipped her off, sharing the evidence we'd gathered. "He's been lying to me for months," she said, her voice shaky with emotion. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't think it was this. "We've both been played," I replied. "But now we have the truth." She paused before asking, "What are you planning to do next?" "Let the consequences take their course," I said. By evening, the pieces were falling into place. Sophie returned home later than usual, her face flushed and her demeanor unusually cheerful. She had no idea the papers had been filed, that her family knew the truth, or that Mark's life was also unraveling. As she kissed me hello and settled into the couch, I stared at her, wondering how she could pretend everything was fine. Little did she know, the first domino had already fallen, and soon, her carefully curated facade would come crashing down. Sunday morning arrived, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the coffee machine. Sophie sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through her phone, while I pretended to read the news on my tablet. My mind was racing, but my face remained calm. Today was the day. "I was thinking," Sophie began, "we should do a date night soon, just the two of us. It's been a while." The audacity of her words nearly made me laugh. I set the tablet down and looked at her, forcing a smile. "That's a great idea," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She didn't realize it, but this was the last time she'd sit at this table pretending we were the happy couple. Around noon, I got a call from Evelyn. "Everything's finalized," she said. "Papers are ready to serve, and the accounts are locked. Are you prepared for this?" "I've been ready for weeks," I replied. An hour later, Greg texted me. "They're sending the server now. Should be there within the hour." I looked over at Sophie, who was lounging on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine. I wondered how she would react. Would she cry? Lash out? Beg? I didn't know, but I was prepared for anything. The doorbell rang at 2 p.m. Sophie glanced at me. "Are we expecting someone?" "No idea," I said, standing and heading to the door. A man in a suit stood there, holding an envelope. "Good afternoon. I have legal documents for Mrs. Sophie, last name," he said. I turned to Sophie, who was already walking toward us, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's this about?" she asked. "You'll want to open it and see," I said calmly. She took the envelope, her hands trembling as she tore it open. Her eyes scanned the pages, and I saw the moment the reality hit her. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to form words. This is a mistake," she stammered. "What is this?" "It's exactly what it looks like," I said, my voice steady. "Divorce papers, complete with evidence of your affair." Her eyes darted back to the documents, then to me. I know everything, Sophie. About Mark. About the hotel. About your plans to leave me while draining our accounts. I've known for weeks." Her face crumpled as she began to speak, but I held up a hand. I don't want your excuses or your apologies. This is the end." Tears filled her eyes. "Please, let's talk about this. We can work it out. It didn't mean anything." "Stop lying," I snapped, my calm veneer cracking just enough to let my anger show. "It meant enough for you to risk everything. And now, you've lost it all." Sophie collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. For a moment, I felt a twinge of pity, but it quickly evaporated. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I walked out of the room, leaving her to process the wreckage of the life she had destroyed. The hours after the confrontation were a blur. Sophie spent most of the day locked in the bedroom, sobbing or making frantic calls. I imagined she was dialing Mark or maybe her mother, trying to piece together what had just happened. I didn't care. I busied myself with the next steps, confirming with Greg that the locks would be changed the following morning and ensuring the movers would pack her belongings into storage by the end of the week. By evening, Sophie emerged, her face blotchy and eyes red from crying. "We can fix this," she said, her voice trembling. "We can go to counseling. I'll end things with Mark. Please, just give me one more chance." I stared at her, shaking my head. "You ended this, Sophie. The moment you chose him, you made your decision. This marriage is over." Her voice rose, desperation creeping in. "You can't just throw it all away. What about the years we've spent together? What about everything we've built?" Her words stung, but I refused to let them sway me. "Everything we've built? You destroyed it the moment you betrayed me. I've already filed the papers. This isn't up for debate." That night, Sophie stayed in the guest room, though she hardly slept. I could hear her pacing, crying, and making more phone calls. My phone buzzed once, Mark, calling from a blocked number. I didn't answer. By Monday, the fallout spread beyond our home. Sophie's parents called, demanding an explanation. Her mother, initially defensive, quickly changed her tone when I laid out the facts. I forwarded her the evidence, a sanitized version, but enough to leave no doubt. Her father, a stern and pragmatic man, called me back directly. "I'm sorry for what she's done," he said solemnly. "You don't deserve this." It wasn't long before whispers started circulating in Sophie's social circles. Friends who once idolized her began pulling away, either ashamed of her actions or fearful of being associated with the scandal. I didn't have to lift a finger. The truth spoke for itself. As for Mark, his life was unraveling just as quickly. His soon-to-be ex-wife took the evidence I provided and filed her own legal action. Between her divorce proceedings and the revelation of his financial struggles, His world was collapsing. Sophie's behavior grew erratic as reality set in. She pleaded, bargained, even tried blaming me for her choices. "You were distant," she said one evening, her voice tinged with anger. "You made me feel invisible. Don't you dare try to make this my fault," I replied, my voice firm. "You could have talked to me. You could have been honest. Instead, you lied and betrayed me." Her arguments crumbled under the weight of her guilt. But she didn't stop trying. I received countless texts, ranging from heartfelt apologies to bitter accusations. I ignored most of them. The day Sophie was forced to leave the house was bittersweet. The movers arrived early, boxing up her things while I stayed out of sight. She avoided eye contact, her face a mix of humiliation and resentment. "I hope you're happy," she spat as she carried the last of her bags to her car. "I will be," I replied simply, watching her drive away. That night, I changed the locks and sat alone in the living room, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. The chapter was finally closed. In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself. Therapy helped me process the anger and betrayal, while time with friends reminded me of the support system I still had. I started working out more, taking on new projects at work, and rediscovering hobbies I'd neglected. Sophie, on the other hand, floundered. Word spread about her affair, and even those who had once supported her distanced themselves. Mark left her shortly after the divorce papers hit, cutting his losses and moving out of state. For the first time in years, I felt free. 6 months later, I ran into Sophie by chance at a coffee shop. She looked tired, her once vibrant energy dulled by the weight of her mistakes. "You look good," she said hesitantly, her voice tinged with regret. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my tone polite but distant. There was a pause before she asked, "Do you think we could ever talk? Maybe try to, I don't know, rebuild some kind of friendship?" I shook my head, offering a small, sad smile. "No, Sophie. That part of my life is over. I've moved on, and I hope you do too." As I walked away, I felt no anger, no bitterness, just peace. Sophie's choices had torn our marriage apart, but they had also set me on a path to a stronger, happier version of myself. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't taking something from someone. It's living a life so full and content that their absence feels like a blessing.